That night's shift began like so many others, but something felt wrong in the air. The silence in the emergency room wasn't calming. It was clinical, almost artificial. When the patient arrived, I knew immediately. His body was failing in cascade. Cold skin, intense sweating, a stare far too fixed for someone with such severe neurological compromise. It was the kind of case that announces disaster before the first test. His vital signs deteriorated rapidly, yet his speech remained disturbingly organized. As we connected the monitors, he described each step of the protocol with uncomfortable precision. He named medications before they were prepared. He commented on blood pressure values before they appeared on the screen. There was no confusion typical of hypoxia. There was lucidity in a body that should no longer sustain consciousness. The absence of identification raised suspicion. Fingerprints revealed the impossible. This man had been declared dead 20 years earlier, a victim of irreversible cardiac arrest. The old report described total failure, no response to resuscitation. The same scenario now unfolding in front of me. Medicine hates coincidences like this. They point to error, or something worse. Investigating his background, we uncovered an obsession with liminal states. He had participated in unconventional studies on near-death experiences, prolonged brain monitoring, and controlled hypoxia. Colleagues from that time reported that he wanted to prove consciousness does not collapse with the heart, not as spiritual theory, but as a poorly understood physiological phenomenon. The electrocardiogram began to fail. Severe arrhythmias, minimal response to medication. His body entered systemic collapse. Then he gripped my forearm with strength incompatible with his condition and said neutrally, "When the line goes flat, I'll still be conscious." Seconds later, the monitor entered complete asystole. Cardiac arrest confirmed. Total absence of pulse. No detectable electrical activity. We initiated immediate resuscitation. Compressions, ventilation, drugs, everything by protocol. Then came absolute clinical shock. While the heart remained inert, he kept talking. A steady voice. No respiratory effort. No fluctuation. A dead body sustaining continuous speech. He described internal sensations with disturbing precision. He spoke of stagnant blood, lack of oxygen, progressive organ failure. He narrated his own physiological collapse as if observing an external procedure. There was no pain, only analysis. The team hesitated, not from fear, but because no medical training prepares you to hear a corpse explain its own death. For nearly 6 minutes, the monitor remained flat. Still, he described the team's movements, technical errors, adjustments not yet made. He predicted the defibrillator failure seconds before it occurred. Consciousness seemed to operate independently of the body, as if the brain were offline, yet something continued functioning. When the heart resumed beating, no one celebrated. The return of circulation brought immediate discomfort. He opened his eyes slowly and said, "Now it hurts more." Hours later, he progressed to definitive brain death. No response, no cortical activity. The body remained alive only by artificial support. Consciousness, apparently, had left. The case was officially treated as a perception error caused by extreme stress, but the recorded audio contradicted that narrative. Clear speech during total absence of cardiac activity. Objective data. From that night on, I understood something unsettling. Perhaps cardiac arrest does not silence consciousness. Perhaps it only releases something the body normally keeps contained. In the days that followed, I reviewed older cases with other physicians. Many recalled similar episodes, always dismissed as perceptual failures. Voices during extreme hypoxia, coherent comments in states incompatible with brain activity. The difference was that almost no one documented them, not from negligence, but instinct. There was deep discomfort in recording something that challenged medical practice itself. An intensivist reported a patient who described cellular necrosis during asystole. He spoke of a progressive shutdown sensation, listing organs in the correct order of failure. Laboratory data confirmed each stage. It was not metaphorical language. It was precise clinical description coming from a body without effective circulation. These reports shared a disturbing pattern. The longer the clinical death, the more organized the speech. Short durations produced fragmented phrases. Prolonged periods generated cold, almost academic analyses. It was as if consciousness, deprived of the body, became more stable. An idea that contradicts everything we know about brain function. Reviewing my patient's history, I discovered he had volunteered for deep hypoxia protocols in the 1990s. Studies discontinued due to inconsistent results. Some reports mentioned language persistence after circulatory collapse. All were archived, not for lack of evidence, but for lack of acceptable explanation. During those tests, nurses reported something specific. Patients described their own bodies as failing systems, almost mechanical. They spoke of valves, pressure, interrupted flow. There was no emotion, only observation. This suggested the experience was not hallucinatory, but dissociative. Consciousness appeared separated from the physiological stress response. Returning to the emergency audio, I noticed something everyone had missed. He did not breathe while speaking. There was no chest movement, no vocal variation consistent with ventilation. The voice was unnaturally stable, physiologically impossible. No neurological explanation supports organized speech without adequate cerebral perfusion. A bioengineer analyzed the recordings and identified something even more disturbing. During asystole, there were microelectrical variations in regions not associated with language. Minimal activity, but organized. Not enough for consciousness by current standards, but enough to suggest our parameters may be wrong. After that case, I noticed a behavioral shift among staff. Resuscitations became shorter, quieter, more objective. No one wanted to prolong the moment when the body is clinically dead, not by protocol, but by discomfort, because the longer that state lasted, the more often something seemed to respond. The patient never described lights or peace. He spoke of pressure, density, absence of bodily limits. He said, "Thinking becomes easier when there's no pain." That sentence never entered the chart. It was removed. Perhaps because it implied something unacceptable, that the body limits consciousness more than it sustains it. The case was closed as brain death without relevant complications, but for me, it marked the beginning of an unsettling suspicion. Perhaps consciousness does not depend exclusively on an active brain. Perhaps organic collapse does not immediately destroy it. Perhaps it only exposes it before we know what to do with it. As weeks passed, I realized the fear did not come from an isolated event, but from repetition. Other patients began to show similar patterns. They did not speak during arrest, but before it. They described a sensation of losing anchorage, as if the body no longer held them in place, always minutes before cardiac collapse. These reports never entered medical charts. They were exchanged in hallways, whispered in break rooms. Medicine operates on protocols, but also on selective denial. When something threatens its core logic, silence becomes the default response. And that silence began spreading through critical care units. An anesthesiologist reported patients in prolonged arrest showing residual motor responses incompatible with absent perfusion. Small, precise movements without reflex patterns. These were not spasms, they were directed actions, as if something was still attempting to interact with the environment despite inadequate organic support. My patient's case became informally known as the breaking point. Before him, episodes were rare and disorganized. Afterward, they became structured, speech clearer, perception sharper. It felt as if something had been learned, as if consciousness, once exposed beyond the body, found ways to adapt. Reviewing his personal notes, I found a disturbing line. The body filters too much. He described clinical death as a state of reduced physiological noise. No pain, no chemical impulse, no instinct, only perception. That would explain the coldness of the reports and the absence of panic during organ failure. This idea was more frightening than any spiritual hypothesis. If true, it meant the active brain does not create consciousness, it restricts it, and that shutting the system down, even temporarily, allows something broader to emerge. An unacceptable thought for a science built on control and predictability. Hospitals began quietly revising maximum resuscitation times. No official memos, just practical changes. Compressions stopped sooner, less insistence, as if, instinctively, someone understood that prolonging that intermediate state carried consequences we could not measure. The fear was not of making mistakes, it was of hearing again, because each report seemed more aware than the last, more precise, more observant. Some physicians began saying patients knew too much. They commented on decisions before they were made, anticipated failures. It should not have been possible, yet it kept happening. During a night shift, a nurse summarized everything in a single sentence. They become more lucid when the body shuts down. No one replied, because everyone knew that sentence should make no sense. And yet, it perfectly described what we had been witnessing in silence. The case stopped being merely disturbing. It became a clinical warning. Perhaps resuscitation is not just an act of saving lives. Perhaps it is a direct interference in a process we do not fully understand. And perhaps, by insisting too much, we allow something to cross back with us, unnoticed. As cases accumulated, the psychological toll on professionals became visible. Experienced physicians avoided night shifts. Residents showed anxiety before critical calls. It was not fear of death. It was fear of the interval, the moment when the body fails, yet something remains active, aware, and sometimes excessively conscious. Some colleagues reported persistent insomnia. Others began mentally reviewing every resuscitation they had ever performed. The question was always the same. Did I prolong it too long? There was no clinical guilt. There was existential discomfort. The sense that something had been observed without consent. Most disturbing was the change in atmosphere during prolonged arrests. The room felt quieter than normal. Sounds muted, communication strained, as if the space itself reacted to the absence of circulation. It was not measurable, but it was consistently reported by different teams on different shifts. The man from my shift seemed to have anticipated all of this. His personal writings suggested the greatest risk was not dying, but returning with consciousness too expanded to fit the body. He described volunteers who came back misaligned, unable to fully reconnect to normal function. That could explain why some resuscitated patients showed subtle but permanent cognitive changes. Not classic deficits, but emotional distancing, excessive observation, difficulty responding to suffering. As if part of the human experience had been left behind with the inert body. In one specific resuscitation, a recovered patient later asked why the noise had returned. When questioned, he explained that while dead, thinking was clean. No pulse, no internal disturbance. The return of circulation was described as uncomfortable. No chart is designed to record that. Gradually, I understood that the horror was not in what patients saw. It was in what they felt upon returning. Life seemed heavier, more restrictive, as if the body were an excessively noisy structure for something that, for a few minutes, functioned better without it. The strain peaked when a colleague refused to initiate resuscitation on a terminal patient despite clinical indication. He simply said, "We've done this too many times." The silence that followed was absolute. No one contradicted him. Everyone understood what he meant. Revisiting the original case, I realized the patient never asked to survive. He asked us not to interrupt the process while he remained conscious. Perhaps he knew each forced return left marks, not just on the body, but on the structure of consciousness itself. At that point, the conclusion became unavoidably clear. Perhaps medicine confuses organic silence with absence, and perhaps by insisting on bringing someone back, we are interrupting something that remains active, organized, and far more lucid than we are prepared to admit. I decided to review the case one final time with clinical detachment, audio files, timestamps, vital parameters. That was when I noticed something crucial. Throughout the entire cardiac arrest, the patient never reacted to external stimuli. No reflexes, no attempts at interaction. He simply narrated, as if he was not there to communicate but to observe. That realization completely changed the interpretation of the event. He was not speaking to us, he was speaking about us, commenting on decisions before they were verbalized, anticipating actions as if they had already occurred. This suggested not just residual consciousness, but perception displaced from normal clinical time. In one specific audio segment, recorded while no pulse was detectable, he described the exact moment I would sign the death certificate hours later. He mentioned my hesitation, the change of pen, the silence in the administrative room. Details impossible to infer at that point. That was not memory, it was anticipatory observation. From that moment on, the most disturbing hypothesis imposed itself. Perhaps consciousness, when deprived of the body, is no longer bound to the physiological present. Perhaps it enters a state where future decisions already exist as observable outcomes. Clinical death not as erasure, but as perceptual displacement. That would explain why he showed no fear when entering asystole again. Organic collapse seemed irrelevant. The body was merely a medium. Consciousness was already operating outside it. The definitive brain death may not have been failure. It may have been the moment he chose not to return. After this case, protocols were quietly adjusted, not by ethics committees, but by informal consensus. Shorter resuscitations, less insistence on prolonging arrest. Not out of compassion, but caution, because no one wanted to repeat the experience of hearing a dead body narrate the team's own actions. Modern medicine depends on the premise that life and consciousness end together. This case weakened that foundation, not publicly but internally. Like a fracture everyone can see but no one mentions, because admitting it would mean acknowledging that we revive bodies without knowing exactly what we bring back. Now, when a patient enters cardiac arrest, I observe more than the monitors. I observe behavior before collapse, the stare, the excessive calm. Because I learned that cardiac silence does not always mean absence. Sometimes it simply means something has changed position. The man who kept talking after he died was officially classified as a stress-induced perceptual error. Unofficially, he became a boundary, a case no one wants repeated. Not due to technical failure, but because it revealed something medicine cannot measure or contain. This was the most disturbing case of my career as an emergency physician, not because a patient died and kept talking, but because he demonstrated with clinical precision that cardiac death does not immediately end consciousness. It only creates an interval, and perhaps not everyone who enters that interval wants or manages to return the same way.